You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
Hey, Chris. Glad you made it to the studio today.
Yes, I've actually been here. This is the 5th of 5 we're recording, so...
No, that's good.
Yeah, but they don't know that.
Yeah, right. Well,
but now
thanks for blowing it for me. I was trying to act like it, you really took it serious and got here again.
No, actually, it's noon, and we started recording we got here, 8:30?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, but that's neither here nor there. Today, we're talking about God's promise to Abraham.
Yeah.
And before he was Abraham, he was Abram.
Right.
Which, even when I talk about him, I have a hard time saying Abram.
I always forget to call him Abram.
Yeah.
But this is the beginning now of God starting to bring clarity to his promise to provide a solution for humanity's sin.
Yeah.
Is through this promise that Abraham begins to bring a lot more clarity as to what's going to happen.
Yeah. So we're going to look at two passages today. Genesis 12, 1 through 8, which I will read, then we'll talk about it. And then we're going to jump over to chapter 15 and read a few verses from there. Yeah. But let's go ahead and pick up. I'm reading from the NLT, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 8. It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you.' So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and he headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived at Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem, and he set up camp beside the oak of Morah. At that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'I will give this land to your descendants.' And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. And after that, Abram traveled south and set up a camp in the hill country, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. Then Abram traveling south by stages toward the Negev."
So this is the time when God says, "Listen, I'm going to make a great nation from you," right? Ultimately, it's Abram's family, that Jesus ultimately comes from that family. So this promise that they're going to be a blessing is not only a day-to-day blessing to the people around them, but ultimately the entire world was going to be blessed because of Abram's family.
Yeah. And by the way, God changes his name to Abraham, just like he does with other people in the Bible, just in case we're wondering. We didn't really say that.
Right.
But so that's why we're going to call him Abram. But yeah, this is amazing to me because, as a kid, we learned the song Father Abraham. Do you know that song?
Had many sons.
Yeah. Many sons had Father Abraham.
Yep.
And then they would always say, "I am one of them, and so are you, and so are you." So anyway, the point is I remember singing that in kids' church, and I taught that to kids and everything else. But Father Abraham is, with even other world religions, they all recognize, most of them recognize Father Abraham as a founding father.
The three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all would point back to Abram. And by the way, there's direct connection for all three of them. Back to Abram.
Yeah, that's right. So Abram's a pretty big deal. And so here God is saying, "I'm going to bless the nations through you." And, and later on, I think he even says, as the number of grains on the sand.
Yeah, we're going to read that in just a second.
That's in the second.
Promise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, this is a great big thing. And I think that talking about this, it is probably beyond our comprehension to even put ourselves in Abram's place when he says, "Leave your native country and go to a strange land." And not only that, but you're gonna have to be given this land through victory. and go on this big long journey and leave your relatives, your father's family, and go to this land that I'm going to show you. So it was Abraham's obedience,
Yes.
really, and his willingness. So sometimes God asks us to do things that we don't understand, and probably, he probably doesn't ask us to do things like this unless he's going to call us to a mission field across the country.
Well, you got a guy that is very successful. He's pretty wealthy already before he even starts heading in that direction. He has all the comforts of life. He's got servants. He has a large family, all these things. And then God says, listen, I'll make you famous and I'll bless you beyond your comprehension and I'll change the world because of you, but not here. Mm-hmm. You got to get up and head to the promised land, right? This is where the phrase promised land came from, was God had promised them that they would have this land. And so when he heads towards Canaan, Canaan is makes up a portion of Lebanon through Jordan, all of what we would consider modern day Israel, the Palestinian areas down into and heading towards Egypt. All of that area is the promised land, which is now, we look at it as mostly Israel, but that's the promised land that he heads towards. Then when he sets up camp, right, what does it say? Between Bethel and Ai, there, that's really close to where Jerusalem is today, not far. And he kind of settles in there, and it's a pretty cool story.
Yeah, it is very cool. And then his wife Sarai, she later becomes Sarah. And there's a lot of different things that God's going to do through Abram, and he certainly takes the journey. And there's a lot of different stories with him and his wife and everything else. But it starts here. Yeah, this is it.
And I think it's fair in this moment for us to think about, God might be trying to lead you to a life of greater impact, right, and of greater blessing. But it might require to make a move of some kind. You can't just stay in your comfort zone. You have to step out of your comfort zone. And we discover later in the book of Romans, and it's mentioned in Hebrews, that it was his obedience that demonstrated his faith. So it wasn't his actions that saved him. It was his faith in God that gave him a right relationship with God. But it was demonstrated by his actions. I think a lot of people talk a good game about how important their faith is, but they've never actually stepped out of their comfort zone and followed God. Yeah. And so that's a really big challenge, I think, and it's the most important part of the whole story to this point.
Yeah, well, we sort of just talked about that in the last series when we talked about Peter, where it's like it's how big is your God? Yeah. So the one who's asking Abram to do this, that's really the key. Right. So he's like, I'm going to do whatever God says, right? Because I know no matter how scary it is, it's going to work out.
So Abram's in a unique place where almost everybody in the world, at least in his world, were pagans, right? They had these big ziggurats that would be similar to maybe precursors to pyramids. They were worship centers. There was a lot of worshiping of the stars and the moon and the sun, all kinds of paganism. And I had a Jewish rabbi. I was in the UAE, just outside of Abu Dhabi. I had a Jewish rabbi tell me that Abram was chosen by God, according to their tradition, because when he looked at the sun, the moon, and the stars, he did not have a desire to worship them. He had a desire to learn and meet the creator of them. And this is what set him apart. Because, there wasn't any like Christian religion back then. But God saw a guy whose heart was towards God. And God said, okay, you're the one I'm going to bless. It's kind of neat. So, as we're trying to move through life, instead of getting caught up by the tangible things, the sun, the moon, and stars, the cars, the houses, the stuff, instead go to the gift giver, not the gifts, right? Yeah. And God then chose to bless him because of it.
Yeah, that's a good lesson.
I think we can move on from there because the next couple chapters, Lot is his nephew. Lot becomes pretty prosperous in and of himself, and they decide they're going to split. They split up. Lot goes his way, and then these kings come in and they conquer Lot and his whole household. They take all of his stuff. And you want to know how significant, how wide of a path Abram is cutting at this point. Abram puts together an army out of his own household and goes and defeats these kings. And then he gives a tithe of all of the plunder to this guy named Melchizedek, which is a whole other really great story. And then he starts getting nervous after that, after he rescues his nephew, thinking, we might be in trouble now because I've made a bunch of enemies in this land. But prior to that, it was peaceful. But now I've made enemies because I fought these kings. And he's afraid. He's forgotten the promise. So if you go to chapter 15, God expands on the promise he gave in chapter 12. it says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you." And this is a big promise there, right? It's kind of similar to the promise he said, "Those who bless you, I'll bless, and those who curse you, I'll curse." Right? In this one now, he says, "I'm going to protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?" Then God goes down and gives him this very significant spiritual encounter that kind of confirms it for him. But so in this instance, he's reminding God made all these promises. "I'll protect you, Abram," and all that stuff. But Abram's like, "Yeah, you made promises before, and you said I was going to have a great family. And here we are years later, I still have no family." And in their tradition in the day, the oldest firstborn servant from your household would wind up being your heir if you didn't have a son of your own. And so God is reaffirming for him, "I'm going to make a great nation from you, and it's not going to be from your adopted servants in your family. It's going to be your own flesh and blood." And so that's pretty big.
Yeah, and can you even imagine? So Abram is standing there, and at this point he has no son. He's mourning over it, and he's thinking, "I don't even have one son." And then the promise is so grand, isn't it? So he says, "Count the stars if you can." And so think about that visual.
Oh yeah.
Right. So God's not going to say that on a cloudy day.
Right.
So Abram looks up, and he can't even come close to counting the stars. And the promise is so far away from where he stands, what he feels about his life, what he is, what he has anxiety over, depression, and so the promise is like, this is what your future is. Sometimes I wish that we could fast forward in the future and see that everything's going to work out okay.
Right.
Or we're going to see that, the thing that I'm worried about is going to work out, and this status that I'm going to reach, or this security, or the safety that I wish for my children, and all these different life goals that I have out in front of me, or my retirement, or whatever it is.
Right.
I wish we could just fast forward and go, "Oh, I just know it's going to be fine."
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, this is what's given as a gift to Abram. And again, it's so far away from where he stands. It's like, can you even imagine what that must have done to his soul?
Yeah.
He thought to himself, "Wow, I don't have to worry at all. All these things I've been feeling this entire time, God knew that everything was going to be, this way."
Yeah. Now, he has an ebb and flow to that kind of commitment to believing, right? It does say there that the Lord, Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness because of his faith. But then we find later he winds up trying to force God's hand again. He winds up having relations with his wife's servant, and then adopts that son that he gets from there. That causes all kinds of problems. And then God comes back and says, "Well, what are you doing? I promised you a son, and I'm going to give you a son with Sarah." And he's 100 years old when his boy is born, right?
Right.
So sometimes we can get discouraged waiting for God's promises. And there's kind of if we're not careful, we'll give into temptation to try to help God out, kind of move this along, because we tend to expect God to work on our timetables instead of on his own. And God was going to do a great miracle, and he was waiting until it was impossible for Abram and Sarai to do it on their own. And then God was going to step in so that they would know 100% sure only God could have done this. But during that time, he kept having temptations. Well, maybe Eliezer's going to have to be my heir. Well, maybe I better go have a son with somebody else in order to be able to have an heir. He was panicking maybe that God wouldn't bless him like he promised. But God always keeps his promises just on time.
Hey, I remember being in youth group when I was in high school, and I remember a whole message by the pastor's wife that talked about how Sarah laughed. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Uh-huh. So when she found out that she was going to have a baby?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, they kind of tried to force God's hand with Ishmael, right? And so they adopted Ishmael. And by the way, that's kind of where it split for the Islam, didn't it?
Right.
They sort of traced their heritage through Ishmael. But But Beth Gillespie was my youth pastor's wife, and she gave this whole big talk about how the promise was given. Here it was, and yet because it didn't happen in the timing that she wanted it to, and she had considered herself past the age, meaning like, oh, God can't do this. Then when she found out she was going to be pregnant, she laughed, and it was just interesting to me how it stuck in my mind, like laughing at God's promises. But then the older I got, the more I realized, like, we sort of do that all the time. Promises are given to us, and we sort of get to the point where we're like, well, that's not going to happen. Right. And we can laugh it off. Yeah. And just because maybe perhaps it doesn't work out in our own timing, or just because maybe we start to not believe it, or maybe that God can't do it. Yeah. Right. And so it's just an amazing thing how God gives the promise, and, we should just trust it.
Well, Matthew, Jesus says, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness. So seek first God's mission and what he's doing on the planet and his right way of living, and all these other things will be added to you. That's a direct promise to every follower of Jesus. And yet, so many of us decide, well, I just have to be dishonest at work because that's the only way you can get business done here. I just have to shoot a move because that's the only way you can get ahead. We start to think that we have to grab life by the horns in order to achieve all the things we want to achieve, when God says, listen, if you'll seek me first in my kingdom, if you'll choose to live the right way, all these other things will be added to you. So God says, I'll give you a better way, but we oftentimes get tempted to go the way the world goes in order to achieve what we feel like we're supposed to have in our life.
By the way, I used to sing that verse too.
Oh, did you?
Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Yeah. So it's Matthew 6:33. Yeah. So I just want to just ask you. So if you were to contemplate this context and just give a single thought, what would you say would be the take home for our listeners?
I think that Abram choosing to believe God, this faith was counted to him as righteousness. God says, okay, your faith is what is what sets you apart, makes you a follower of me. But faith always is followed by real actions. And we see this. He does get up and he leaves his home and he leaves his security and he does follow God. And I think that if we're claiming to be people of faith, we also need to be then, by extension, people of action. Yeah. Not for the sake of salvation, but because of it.
Yeah, that's a great thought. And I would say the take home for me is what I referenced earlier, which is let's be careful not to laugh off God's promises too quickly. Yeah. Because we do it not knowingly, we don't intentionally do it, but our hearts can be discouraged. We can start to doubt, either because we believe he hasn't done it yet, or maybe he can't do it. But let's not laugh off God's promises, because if the promises are given from God's word to us, we can trust in it and we can believe it, because it's God who's given the promise.
Yeah. That's really powerful. Now, next Monday, we're going to be talking about one of the most difficult days in Abram's life.
Abram and Isaac.
When he sacrifices, or is ready to sacrifice Isaac. So
yeah, crazy story. Yeah. Crazy.
It's an amazing picture of Jesus, right? And God the Father. But this is maybe the most agonizing moment in his life. I think it's going to be a really good one. Yeah. And then after that, we're going to get into all kinds of other things too. We'll get into 10 Commandments and the Passover, all those things next week. So
yeah. So I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday then. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.